My name is Joost Schouten, and I am here today to talk a little bit about how does self-organization work? How can we come together, collaborate in pursuit of purpose, and create an impact? That's easier said than done, and I want to explore some of the major elements at play when we look at self-organization and distributed authority, so that we can get really good at playing this game together and actually create a massive impact that serves all of humanity and the planet. Right, welcome. I'd like to talk a little bit about self-organization within Haifa, within Seeds, or any do for that matter. So really explore the question, how do we collaborate together? How do we do work in pursuit of purpose? When there's no bosses, no management hierarchy, and when decision-making is distributed and decentralized. That's a massive topic, and I don't anticipate covering everything in all detail here today, but I do want to cover a couple of the basics. So what are the moving parts that show up, and how can we start interacting with them? So let me just dive straight in there. I think a really important key question to ask first is why would you want to self-organize at all, right? So usually when I've got an audience, I do a nice interaction here, but since this is a recording, I'll dive straight into some of the answers I usually get, and they generally fall into buckets, right? So there's organizational reasons and there's personal reasons. And from the organizational side, the answers that I usually get are we want to be more responsive to change. Right? We want to adapt to our ever-changing environment. Or we want to end the skill silos, right? So there's different departments that need to work together and they have a hard time doing so. I want to be more effective or more efficient in our collaborations, actually make sure that the work that we're doing has the impact that we want it to have. We want to integrate all the wisdoms that show up, right? So really utilize the skills that show up at the table rather than just a few smart heads at the top of the hierarchy making all the decisions. And whether or not they're smart is to be argued, right? And then there's the personal motivations, the intrinsic motivation, right? So I really want to be passionate about what I do. I want to be motivated by simply showing up, not necessarily for being compensated for it. We want to improve a healthy culture so that we can actually love our peers and work with people that we're deeply passionate about, and feel safe in that environment. Equality is not to be confused with sameness, but for the equal opportunity for all that show up within our collaborations to thrive and to utilize and express their skills. Psychological safety, I touched upon that in the culture. I think that's a massive part of personal reasons to move away from management hierarchy. I actually think it is the driver why people are looking for alternatives generally, because there is an inherent psychological unsafety in management hierarchies. Management hierarchies work because of their power structures, power over, and that comes with inherent psychological safety issues that need to be addressed, and is a big motivation for people to actually say, hey, let's see how we can do this differently. And another one is purpose over profit, right? So it has a lot to do with intrinsic motivation that I started with, but to really want to make an impact, something that you're deeply passionate about, and not just show up to maximize shareholder return for those that have invested. Now, what's really important here is to differentiate between these different reasons why you would want to self-organize. Because what you actually quite often see is that organizations choose to do an experiment of self-organization for organizational reasons, where the people that step into that experiment are deeply passionate for their personal motivation, and there might actually be a mismatch there. Sometimes there is not the full personal potential possible if the organization is wanting it for organizational reasons. So it's important to distill that out. Why are we doing this experiment at all? I think not necessarily just as relevant within Seeds or Haifa or another do as it would be for a conventional organization, but still very relevant to explore as to what is it that we're serving here, and what tools are we thus prioritizing to use. And is that serving? Let me actually then jump to the next question because I'm getting ahead of myself. What is it then that we're self-organizing? Right, so that falls into two buckets, and I think this again really relates to why you want to do it in the first place. Is what are you self-organizing around? Are you self-organizing around a clear purpose, or are you self-organizing to serve a group of people? And again, without clarity, it gets really tricky to figure out how to do that well. And just to outline a couple of different examples, when you look at purpose, like that can be NGOs are often very purpose-driven. Actually, commercial organizations are also purpose-driven. Their purpose is just often maximizing shareholder profit by XYZ, still purpose to be served. Purpose-driven organizations, pretty obvious. And I think Haifa or more defined dues within Seeds serving a specific goal, serving a specific purpose. So maybe Samara or Renaissance Explorers. These, in my mind, are really well-defined purpose-driven organizations that are served by self-organization serving that purpose. And on the other side, you have people. So, and examples of that is communities coming together. Like they self-organize, they distribute or decentralize decision-making to serve all the people showing up. Shared living communities or a village for that matter. Or, and this is kind of what I'm driving at, Seeds. Now, this is an ongoing exploration and debate to figure out how these dues differ from Seeds. But this is kind of how I'm seeing it. Right? Seeds is very open and inclusive. And that gets harder when you're trying to collaborate together to achieve a specific purpose, like Haifa Renaissance Explorers. That doesn't necessarily need to have fully open boundaries because it doesn't exist for inclusion per se. It exists to achieve a specific purpose and create a certain impact. And that impact might be inclusivity, but that doesn't necessarily mean it does welcomes all skills, because not all skills are necessary to drive the specific purpose of the entity. Let's take Haifa, for example, primarily building software to enable this regenerative renaissance. If I'm a very skilled baker, my skills might not necessarily be very useful in Haifa, and thus Haifa should say, no, we don't need those skills right now. Where if I step into a community, that is a very different assessment and consideration, then by default I'm welcome because I'm part of the community, regardless of who I am or what I do. Again, really important to considerations that the characteristics of what you are self-organizing is different. Are you self-organizing around purpose, self-organizing around people? Nice little lead in to actually trigger those questions so that you can also ask yourself, if you are exploring the concepts of self-organization, distributed, decentralized authority, what parts apply to your specific context? It's really important to get started before you dive into this exploration. Before we dive into the key concepts of self-organization and some of the tools used to self-organize, I want to take a brief moment to explore the alternative, right? So it's never a choice to self-organize or not. You self-organize or choose something else. It's just that other thing is the de facto default that is also deeply ingrained in us that we hardly ever see it as a choice. But it's a choice. And that choice often looks a little bit like this. Now, this is an exaggeration, of course, but the alternative of self-organization is usually a management hierarchy of sorts, right? And in companies, conventional companies, they show up quite explicitly. But in smaller organizations or startups, they also show up more implicitly. Now, the interesting thing about management hierarchies is that they generally function in spite of their official structure, right? So nobody actually goes to work, looks at their job profile or the job description to figure out what they're going to do that day. Nobody uses the org chart to figure out who to go to for a specific question. You know that, and you know that because of culture. You know that because of ingrained interpersonal relationships that you build up over time. And that's, if you look at this picture here, obviously the black lines is the official structure, the colored lines is the interpersonal relationships. And it's the interpersonal relationships that really are crucial for these structures to function, to know where to go, to know what to do. And this is wonderful that it's there, right? It's wonderful that culture allows for work still to be done. But it comes with a big byproduct. And that byproduct is that interpersonal relationships are starting to dictate operational decision making. And so, and a key or an initial response often is we're going to have a flat organization, or we're going to do away with management hierarchy. That doesn't solve the problem, because what's left is culture and like the implicit hierarchies that show up in any community. And they will start dictate decision making. So what does it look like if you really want to embrace the culture to thrive and be whatever it is, without it hijacking operational decision making? I think that's part of the exploration that we're doing here. Another interesting symptom of the alternative is what I call coffee machine decisions, right? And I think we all know that to some extent. And I think the similarity, our coffee machine in Seeds in Haifa is private Discord channels, right? So that is decisions that are being made in a smaller private setting away from the official channels. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But the symptom that I'm trying to hint at here is the private nature of it, the lack of transparency. So to eliminate a whole bunch of voices so that you can not be bogged down by it and actually get shit done without everybody having their say. Now, and I think to some extent we see that show up in Seeds in Haifa because we don't have the proper tools yet to actually effectively make decisions when there's differences of opinion at the table. And in the old system, that's often, hey, let's just quickly make this decision without telling our manager. It'll be fine, because if they do have a say, it just slows us down and we need to go through a sort of approval process. So we all probably recognize parts of this. Now, to quickly go through some of what self-organization looks like, I want to take you through a couple of these, the key concepts. And for starters, I want to just take a moment what self-organization is and how it plays with purpose and purpose manifestation. Because self-organization in and of itself is not a goal. It's there to serve something, and that is purpose manifestation. And I like this analogy of these boats, right? So these boats are all fully self-organized. They can fully figure out what to do and when they do it and how they do it. But if you let them also plot their own course, right? So rather than self-organize, make them self-steering, this boat here on the left might just choose to take a left turn and hang out on the beach. Then they are no longer contributing to our overarching purpose, our point on the horizon that we are here collectively trying to manifest. And that's really the goal of self-organization, to allow us to collectively collaborate for purpose manifestation. And this again is that differentiation, right, between what are we self-organizing around purpose or around people. And what I'm here focusing on a lot in this exploration is self-organization around purpose. How do we come together to manifest purpose? How do we do that collaboration? And for that, self-organization needs to serve a greater good and needs to give us the tools to align together to strengthen each other's contributions to that purpose. And I'll dive into some more the tools on how to do that in a little bit later in this presentation. Another key concept is boundaries. And so what you also often see is in the impulse to move away from management hierarchy is this move towards freedom, right? No one can tell me what to do anymore. That's not necessarily true, right? Self-organization does require a very clear minimum viable set of boundaries that allows us to go to get really effective at manifesting purpose. And this analogy of a freeway, I think, is kind of a good one. It's a poor analogy in the context of the regenerative renaissance, but it's a good analogy for the point I'm trying to make. If you think of a freeway, and there are no lines and there's no rules on what side to drive on, you can never go any faster than 30 kilometers an hour because a car can come from any direction at any time. Because there are there's a minimum viable set of rules and agreements, namely you drive on the right or on the left depending on the country, and you overtake on a certain side, and you go no faster than XYZ. Right? Because of that, all of a sudden we can go so much faster and manifest the purpose. What's the goal of that highway is to go from A to B quickly. Well, and that's wonderful, that's possible. So the goal of self-organization is to figure out what is the minimum viable set of collective agreements that we can establish so that we can get really fast at manifesting our purpose. And this is always tricky because of that personal impulse of I don't want anyone to tell me what I can or cannot do. The wonderful differentiation here is, though, that everybody that shows up should have the ability to change the rules, right? But once those rules are set, everybody's bound by them. And that's actually the essence of governance. So and decentralized governance, right? So setting those agreements and those rules collectively so that we can all adhere to them and know what we can expect from each other when we collaborate in pursuit of purpose. Another pattern, key concept is entrepreneurial spirit, right? Do it now and as quickly as possible, please. Don't wait for approval. And this is a really tricky one. What we often find, and I think we very much see that in Hive and Seeds to some extent, is a consensus culture. That we are not skilled yet at fully driving our own roles in pursuit of purpose and daring to take initiative transparently and not waiting for everybody's nod or approval, and even in the face of disapproval, disagreement, to still do it because you believe it right in pursuit of purpose. Right? Ignoring other opinions is a skill and a muscle we need to train, because if we don't, we're never going to find agreement across this ever-growing lovely group of people, and less will get done. The tricky thing around consensus is consensus always finds the lowest common denominator, meaning we don't innovate. The crazy ones with the crazy ideas need to be given the freedom to experiment, not at any cost, right? We still have agreements that can bind those experiments, but if there's no explicit agreement saying that you shouldn't do something, go for it and do it, even if your peers disagree. And this is a paradigm shift. This is really tricky to do this at scale collectively, and it's crucially important that we embrace this idea. Entrepreneurial spirit for all, and that's not just a right, it's also a duty. So self-organization doesn't just come with more opportunity, it also comes with duties, because without the duty to act and lead your work and lead your role will stagnate and become slower and slower and slower and slower. And I think we're seeing that at different parts of our movement, and we need to break out of that pattern. And I think we can. It just takes some practice. Who cares? I like asking that question, and not so much in the cynical sense, but really in the literal sense. So to ask yourself when you show up, in your collaborations, your work, or wherever that might be, to ask yourself the question, who cares when you come and bring something to the organization? If you bring attention or an idea, to really ask, does the organization care? Do I care? Or ideally both. Right? So because if you bring something to the organization and the organization doesn't care, don't bother it. Leave it alone. You care. By all means, process it, but outside of the bounds and the context of the organization, so that the organization's resources are not used to serve your personal needs. Because that's purpose manifestation, right? Effective purpose manifestation requires all resources should serve organizational purpose. And what we've just identified, if only you care and the organization doesn't care, you're wasting the organization's resources. Now that feels a bit impersonal and maybe even a bit sad or scary. The people that show up within that organization might still collectively care about what you bring. And they might still all show up to serve you in whatever it is that you're bringing. But outside of the boundaries of that organization, they come together in different contexts. And so it's crucially important to answer this question time and time again, and bring with it a role awareness to yourself and to the entire organization. But also, of course, the organization needs the tools to allow you to answer this question. Because generally organizations don't have those tools. If I am the CEO and I'm passionate about my pet project, the organization cares because I'm the CEO and I personally care. The organization has not given us the tools to figure out what that difference is. Like a nice anecdote for me personally, I founded 2 IT companies. And I founded 2 exactly because of this reason. At one point, I wanted to kind of shove something into my initial IT company that I started up, until I realized the organization does not care. It does not care about this extra idea I wanted to bring in. And I personally cared. So what I did, I created a new company, a new IT organization to serve that specific purpose. And that benefited both me personally and the initial IT organization, because its resources were not misused to serve my personal needs. Now, the tools to answer these questions is really, I'll get to that in a second as well, but it's really all about governance, roles, circles, accountabilities, purpose, to really figure out, hey, what is it that I'm bringing, and does the organization care, or does my context that I'm trying to serve, the role might be served, focusing on marketing or whatever it might be, really need what it is that I'm bringing. And this is a constant evolution that we need to bring into a heartbeat within the organization to constantly figure out what is it that we're serving, and do we still have the right people that are showing up serving this organization in pursuit of purpose. I mentioned the heartbeat, and I think this is quite an important concept. And the way I like to frame organizations is as having 3 different heartbeats that are going at all times. We generally don't distinguish between these different heartbeats. And as a result, things kind of feel chaotic and arrhythmic, like there is a whole lot of stuff going on all the time. The 3 different heartbeats I like to point out are an operational heartbeat that's faster, that's most alive, and most of us are there most of the time. That's when we're actually doing our work. And underneath that is a structural heartbeat that is defining how we are doing our work and how are we structured to allow the operational heartbeat to function effectively and fast. And underneath that is the human heartbeat. That's where we show up as people. That's where we connect as people. That's where our communication norms live. And these different heartbeats need to be served explicitly and isolated. Because if you do not, this previous slide of who cares, this previous question on who cares, constantly gets abused. Because we tend to we cannot turn off the human heartbeat. Like, wonderful. No ignoring that. It's always on. But what that means, if we don't make an explicit space for it, tensions that show up in the interpersonal or the personal always make it to the structural and the operational. Right? So that is hijacking operational decision making for personal needs. If we want to manifest purpose, we need to eliminate that, not by saying no to the humans, not saying you are not welcome here, but the inverse. You are fully welcome here, and only human heartbeat tensions are processed here, so that we create a context within which we can really embrace our interpersonal relationships and our personal tensions, and figure out as a collective how we can serve that, how we can hear it, without it making its way into our structure and our operation. And the same goes for structure. We need to have time and a space to actually really work on the organization rather than in the organization, without being distracted by the operational needs. And only once these two heartbeats are fully served can we, without distraction, start doing the work and do it fast and effective. And this is unnatural. It's unnatural to, when we feel the urgency of the moment to get work done, to slow down, to step into the structural needs, and to slow down even more and step into the human needs. It's uncomfortable and unnatural and absolutely crucial. And I think this shift is probably the biggest shift to be made when you move to self-organization, or when you move away from management hierarchy, because it takes the longest time to actually get used to new semantics, new patterns on showing up together. And it heavily relies on facilitation, and those facilitators actually holding space for these different contexts at different times. Now, way beyond the scope of this call on what that facilitation looks like exactly, but I'll invite any and all that are interested in exploring alternative ways of facilitating and serving these different heartbeats to make themselves known, because we can't have enough people serving this differentiation of these three different contexts. Another important principle is incremental work and incremental structure. All right, so I think many of you might know processes of Scrum and Agile, coming from the software methodology, where incremental work is really baked in. What is not baked in with many organizations is incremental structure. Right? What most people know of structural changes within an organization is a reorganization every 3 years, and everybody dreads it because some people lose their job. Right? Like, that's kind of the association we have with structural change. Where if we really want to self-organize and adapt to an changing environment, we need our structure of organization, our collective agreements, our governance to change with small steps each time a change is needed or warranted. Right? So you need to have maybe a bi-weekly or a monthly heartbeat where we check in, is the structure still serving our purpose manifestation? Do we need a new rule? Do we need a new circle? Do we need a new policy? Do we need a new agreement of sorts? So that you can actually really slowly make sure that you're constantly structured in the proper way to serve your purpose manifestation. It's important to make sure that that's incremental and not like a Big Bang theory like conventional organizations do. 3 different types of how you can structure an organization. And I think the first 2 are both quite well known to most of us. Like the idea of centralized, it's, smaller company, one boss, calling all the shots, everybody does it. Which kind of breaks down at a certain scale. And this is really where the management hierarchy excels, right? So this idea of decentralized authority, where you have parts of the authority that are delegated to middle management or lower management that can then delegate that further. And this is really where business units show up. And this is kind of how most of the world is currently organized. The tricky thing with decentralized authority in this way is that it's delegated and it can always be retracted. Right? So what that means is there's always a level of fear, because people generally like to keep what they have been given. So middle managers are usually more incentivized not to do something wrong rather than to best manifest purpose. Right? Because if they do something wrong, it might be taken away from them. Now, I think we all recognize those patterns. And if you move to distributed authority, that's a different game altogether. There is no central authority that delegates that authority out. That's all rooted in our governance. That's all rooted in our agreements that we, in our structural heartbeat, decide upon. And obviously, that over time needs to change and needs to adapt to figure out how to best service our purpose. But the wonderful thing is that it really incentivizes maximum purpose manifestation, because you eliminate the risk of the judgment from higher up in the hierarchy telling you that you're right or that you're wrong. Right? So this whole idea of managerial reviews and stuff, if you take that out of the equation, you take out the risk of that assessment out of the equation, and it allows for freer purpose manifestation. Now, there's a lot of intricacies on how this works, and how those different patterns and how you do performance reviews, right? It's still important to figure out how we can actually make sure we've got the right people serving our purpose. A little beyond the scope of this presentation, important to note that it still does need attention. One other important differentiation between these different types of organizing is that in the first two, those little dots, they are people. In the last one, the dots, even though they're drawn as people, are roles. And one person might fill multiple roles, or one role might be multi-filled by different people, right? So people can show up in different parts of the organization. And that's also completely new. We're not used to that. Generally, you show up here and here alone. The wonderful thing is that your skills might be useful in multiple parts, in multiple circles. Let's really build a system that cherishes and celebrates that, so that you can really bring your skills to the right part of the organization, or the multiple right places within the organization. And one important part I also want to call out is the idea of agreements as a safety net. Not so much as a needed bureaucracy to tie everything down. Ideally, we are just in our operational heartbeat doing the work effectively, oblivious to our underlying agreements. Right? That's really that's utopia. That's just, hey, we are manifesting purpose and nothing is in our way. We're doing our thing. Now, if for some reason we are harming purpose, or not manifesting it as effectively as we can, then our agreements should start showing up to rectify that wrong. So that if somebody shows up and brings a personal tension, our agreements are there to make sure that that personal tension is dealt with in the right context without it harming operational purpose. So that's really how I like to see agreements. Because again, I think often agreements are kind of seen as, hey, somebody is wielding power over me, where an agreement is different. No, you step into agreement with this collective so that we can manifest purpose properly. And they should be a minimum viable set, right? So I think it's a wonderful pattern to start actually removing and deleting some agreements if they're no longer needed. It's not necessarily a rule book that just always keeps growing. But I think it's an important pattern to keep in mind, that they are their minimum viable set of agreements to allow us to manifest purpose, so that we don't fall into harmful patterns. And harm here is defined by harming purpose manifestation, not necessarily harmful in the general sense. Right, that brings us to the toolbox. What tools are available to us to actually do this work? And to make sure that we bake in those patterns I've just explored into our purpose-driven organization. The first tool I want to talk about, and it's mostly probably a definition, is attention. And I've used it a couple of times already. And when I talk about tensions, people often hear it as a negative thing, because that's kind of in our general daily use, that's kind of how it's seen. But attention here is really a neutral term. Attention is a perceived gap between reality and perceived reality. Right? So the server is down, it should be back up again. Okay, well, that's probably experienced as a negative tension. But there's another tension of that could be positive. Hey, we're doing great, wonderful, and there's another opportunity. I can also land. You know, that's a tension in the positive realm. It's both just a tension between reality and perceived reality. The promise of self-organization is to process every relevant tension into meaningful change in pursuit of purpose. And this is where one of the duties comes in. Everyone that shows up in this in such an environment has the duty to process any relevant tension into meaningful change. So if you sense a tension, you have the duty to assess, to figure out if that's relevant for our organization, and if so, make sure it lands on the desk of the right person. And if that's you, start doing it. And if it's not you, figure out what role, what person is accountable within the organization, and land it on their desk so that they can take it on and autonomously process that tension into meaningful change. So you hear me talk a lot about tensions, and also in relationship to those different heartbeats, right? Because tensions can show up in the different contexts. You might have an operational tension, a structural tension, or a human tension. Or you might actually have a tension that is not related to any of them, that has a solution in one of those three, or all three heartbeats. Interesting exploration. We can do some nice exercises around at a later stage. Right, governance. So governance, in the broadest term, is the way I describe it, is our collective agreements that allow us to collaborate together in pursuit of purpose. Some elements, important elements that show up within governance are circles, roles, domains, and policies. Right, so whenever you change governance, it will be one of these. Right, so a circle and a role are actually exactly the same. They're a holon within our structure that are part of the whole and autonomously accountable for a part of it. And think of that as like a human body. For example, my liver is accountable for one specific thing, or maybe multiple, but it's clearly countable, and it's part of my entire body. It's serving my entire body, yet it is autonomous in what it does. Circles and roles are exactly like that. And it's important to get really explicit about that contract, right? What is it accountable for? What can we expect from it? So that those that fill the role or work within that circle know what is expected of them. And those interacting with it can also hold these people filling those roles and circles to account to deliver that. And this is quite new, right? So this idea of this structural heartbeat to iterate every couple of weeks or every month to figure out, are these contracts still up to date? Do we still have the right accountabilities? Can I actually rely on you on delivering this? And the wonderful thing about this explicit clarity is that it's going to allow for focus, right? So that if somebody comes to your desk and says, could you do this? That you actually have the tools. You can go to your role and figure out, or your roles and figure out, actually, I'm not accountable. I'm going to focus on what I am accountable for, but how can I help you figure out who is accountable? Because what we tend to do is then bring in a personal heartbeat tension, and this, I care for these people. I don't want to disappoint them. And maybe also I want to be seen as supportive or capable and start helping them instantly and immediately. But that comes at the detriment of purpose manifestation, because you are explicitly accountable for something else. So there's an opportunity cost to that helping. And again, this is very unnatural. We are used to just saying, yes, I can help you. But it comes at a cost. So these tools are important, and it comes with a behavioral change that will take time to actually start owning and leaning into. So that's around circles and roles. And I touched upon the idea of role fillers, that you can have multiple roles, or one role can be multi-filled by multiple people. And that's wonderful, right? So that allows for flexibility of showing up in different parts of the organization, and also really eliminating that idea of a people hierarchy, right? You can show up in the hierarchy of the organization at different parts, because there is still a hierarchy within the organization. Right, so that, for example, if you look at my liver again, that's made up of a whole bunch of cells that are autonomous and serving the liver as a whole. So you can really fractal that down, and that hierarchy is wonderful. It's just not a hierarchy of people; it's a hierarchy of purpose. And any person can show up in different parts of the purpose hierarchy. It's a wonderful shift away from people having power over people to purpose having power over sub-purpose. And you want that. You want the overarching purpose to dictate what is needed for it to be achieved. So that nuance is an important distinction. And then beyond that, there are the tools of governance of domains, and domains are like property rights, right? So, for example, we have the website, and the website is owned by Circle X, and they can do with it what they want, and other circles or roles can't touch it if that domain is explicitly assigned to that specific circle or role. And here, wonderful pattern, of course, is if a domain is not assigned, so if it's not made explicit, anyone can interact with it. Right. So this is, again, minimum viable. Only assign the website to a certain circle if that is useful. If it's not being abused, let's not introduce that bureaucracy. Let's just leave the website domain out of it altogether, and let everybody interact with it as they deem fit, because today there's not a problem with it. Some examples that are probably quite useful is maybe a Git repository, or keys to the treasury. Like there's definitely some domains that are useful to anchor in your governance. And then there's policies, right? So policies dictate how we interact together, what we can expect from each other, or perhaps even some workflows where that's needed. Some examples here is we have within Haifa, there's a Haifa game guide that outlines what can be expected of people. That's an example of a policy. So you can be held to those agreements of, that's, for example, where it's defined that you have a duty of role consciousness. You have the duty to make sure that whenever you decide anything or do anything, how that relates to your role or your quest, so that you're really serving that role in the quest and not bringing in your own personal needs. And there's a bunch more outlined there. Interesting exploration of double linking, but I'll just trigger that question in your mind and explore that later, because I think it's a little beyond the scope for today. How do we then actually do work? Because this idea of the human heartbeat and the structural heartbeat of governance, they're all wonderful, but we're here to do work in pursuit of purpose, right? So they are here to serve us to actually do the work. How do you get to that? And I want to quickly touch upon that. And what I outlined here at the bottom is we've identified the roles, and that those roles have accountabilities. That we can hold these roles and the role fillers to account to. An example, for example, is like a role as an analyst with the purpose, all decisions are data-driven. And then accountability, you can imagine that might hold is maintaining analysis tools. I can expect this role to maintain the tools that we use for these analysis. out of that, work needs to come, and each role is autonomously accountable for manifesting the purpose and accountabilities of their roles. Now, a role filler can look at their role and say, hey, I'm going to translate this accountability to a new project, new database installed. Right? That could be a project that this role takes on and just start doing autonomously. It can also be the other way around, that another role says, hey, we need, like a developer, for example, says, we need to have a new database because this is outdated, security risk, or whatever. I'm going to go to this role and ask it to have this new database installed and hold it to account to its accountabilities. Right? So an accountability can work two ways. It can be, you can be externally held to account to, or internally translate that to a project if you wish. Now there's another layer that I think is important to identify. Next to an outcome of project, we had identify next actions. And an example is a request quote for new database, right? Nicely in line with that outcome. Why do I differentiate between actions and projects? I think that has everything to do with our ability to organize our own work within our roles, personal productivity. So this differentiation between actions and projects comes from getting things done from David Allen to a large extent. If we don't differentiate, we tend to procrastinate a lot. What often happens is that we identify a bunch of projects that we might work on, put them on a list and start working, and our eyes skip over one or two all the time. Right? We probably all know that effect, that when you look at a list of things to do, that you skip over something. That happens because of that differentiation between actions and projects. A project, you don't actually know what to do physically. And an action is described in such a way so you physically know what to do. Request quote for new database. I'm going to email this database vendor to get me this quote. I know what to do. What is important is if you have a list of outcomes that you actually take the time to translate that to actions that you can then start doing. This is a skill that is that's often under prioritized and is crucially important within self-organization because of the lack of delegation. Right? There's no central authority, no boss anymore that tells you what to do. So we are personally accountable for translating our roles into action that actually serve purpose. That does require a skill of translating those accountabilities into actions that serve. And that comes with exactly what I outlined there, that you need to build the ability for personal productivity. Now that in and of itself might be served with, I don't know, a 5-week course. And I'm not joking. There's really a lot to explore there. But I just want to highlight it, that this is important matter to look into, and to maybe more importantly, plant the seed that you recognize that you might be procrastinating at time, that you might actually spend way more time in meetings because you are incapable of translating your role into action. That's perfectly fine that you don't know how to do that yet. But waiting on your peers to tell you how to do it is not sufficient. We need to build this, train this muscle and build this skill on how to do that translation. And here, the differentiation then, again, where does that tension live? If you're incapable of translating that, that is purely an operational tension, all right? It's an operational tension of you personally being unable or incapable of translating governance into action. Now, there underneath all of that lies potentially also a human tension that you lack those skills. You want to personally build those skills. So this is a wonderful tension that shows up, that there's an element of the solution that lies in all these different contexts that might all individually need some attention for it to get solved. Yeah, so now we've explored a bunch of key concepts that are at play within self-organization and distributed authority, and some of the tools to explore. Now, there's a lot more meat to that, and I'm happy to dive in with any of you that there's interest to explore more. But one thing I do want to kind of end with is this analogy, the analogy of kicking the ball with a bunch of buddies on the streets or playing Champions League football. What's the difference there? And also what competencies are required for one and the other. And again, to get back to that initial question, what are we doing? What are we self-organizing for? Kicking the ball around with a couple of buddies is really a lot of fun. And in and of its own right, perfectly fine and wonderful to do. And that's entertainment for those partaking. When if you look at Champions League football, it's trying to strive to get the most out of the skills on the pitch in pursuit of that one singular goal and getting that cup at the end. See that as our purpose. Now, if we want to create impact, we have to do a whole lot of skill building to get to that goal. Now, that can be a whole lot of fun, right? We don't have to lose the fun of kicking the ball around with a couple of buddies, but there are some characteristics that differ. Not everybody is necessarily always best suited for achieving that goal. That's not that we don't love them. There's just the right context for the right people at the right time. Now, if we're playing that game, it also comes with agreements that we're bound by. Right? Kicking a ball around with a couple of buddies, we might all know, is sometimes you hit the goalpost. One says you do, and the other says you don't. Was it in? Was it out? We need to have agreements to get clarity on when we scored and when we didn't score. And so, what game do we want to play? And get honest and clear about that for yourself. And then, with that decision, find the context where you can play that. Lovely community with a bunch of friends, having a great time, organizing, self-organizing for the community, or are you self-organizing for a purpose? And if that is the case, then what consequences do you draw, and what purpose are you pursuing? What purpose are you serving? And what skills do you really need to acquire and further to do that well? And I think a couple of those skills that I outlined today, I think really need a lot of attention if we want to get to that purpose, right? And that is personal productivity, how to use governance, how to hold each other to account, how to personally lead, and how to differentiate between the operational, structural, and human heartbeat properly. I love to invite all of you on this journey, and to collectively really get really good at manifesting purpose, so that we can create that society that serves all and the planet. I think that's what I wanted to share today with you today, and thank you very much for listening.